They said my little brother must have drowned in the cave. The uncertainty always ate at me. There was a story about it in the paper. People at church offered their condolences. Kids at school that I never talked to would give me sideways glances. When a 5-year-old gets washed into a cave and there is a 2-week search, it tends to get attention. I never wanted condolences. I wanted closure. Even if he was dead, I needed to see his body. The thought that he could have died down there alone and in the dark was unacceptable to me. When they stopped searching after 2 weeks, my only thought was that it would take someone longer than that to starve to death. There was plenty of water down there. If he had been washed into an inaccessible part of the cave, then he could still be alive. My dad had to physically keep me from trying to go back into the cave myself to tell me that it was over, that he was gone. In my heart, I didn't believe he was dead. I was 16 at the time, a junior in high school. Kieran had been an oops baby 11 years younger than me. He was the sweetest kid, even though he was insane. At age 4, he'd broken a leg and an arm falling about 30 feet out of a tree he had managed to climb. He was always running around climbing and jumping off of things, yelling and laughing. He probably had ADHD in retrospect, but at the time, he annoyed the shit out of me. I would try to do homework, and he would basically whirlwind into my room, like the Tasmanian devil from the cartoons, jumping on the bed and tackling me. He wanted a big brother, but the age gap made it hard for us to bond. Any of my spare time after marching band and homework was spent trying unsuccessfully to get a girlfriend, and I didn't treat him the way I should have. 2 years later, after a lot of therapy, I've stopped blaming myself as much. I know that it was natural to act the way I did to feel the way I did. That even if he annoyed me, it didn't mean I didn't love him deeply. I know that I did. I know that I still do. When I went to UT for college, I met a couple people who were into spelunking. They didn't know about my brother, and I never told them. I couldn't bring myself to tell my parents, knowing what they would think. But I picked it up fast with a conviction that I knew was illogical. I wanted to find his body or find him. It was denial, I knew that much. But I had nightmares about him, nightmares that he was in that cave in the dark screaming my name, but I couldn't find him. After nearly 3 years, they never stopped. My therapist had a whole bunch of thoughts on the matter, as did my parents. But I knew what would give me peace in a way that nothing else could, finding his body. Partway through my freshman year, an opportunity presented itself. Kieran had fallen into a creek that went underground. Since then, we had had record drought and the creek was nearly dry. More than 2 years before, the team had explored everything they could, but the path of the water was not navigable. It was a tunnel completely filled with a fast current, too dangerous to try and send anyone down, even with scuba gear. I needed to see what it looked like now. I should have told someone I was doing it, even just my friends that taught me caving. Instead, I drove back to my parents' neighborhood, took a dirt road into the forest, parked my car, and went back to the cave. For anyone not from that part of the country, it's all limestone. Water eats through it easily, and there are caves everywhere. Most of them aren't as deep as this particular one, but it's normal if you have a few acres of land to have a cave on it. This particular one was in a gully a couple hundred yards from the house I grew up in. Getting my gear out of the trunk, I walked through the familiar hickory and maple's feet, crunching on the dry leaves down the rocky hill to the creek. The mouth of the cave was small, only about 2 feet high and 3 feet wide. I could still picture the yellow tape the police officers directing volunteer search parties day and night. Standing there in the quiet forest, I stared at that black opening as I had so many times. Even though the cave was significant, they'd already explored everything they could, mapped it thoroughly. The water didn't even go over the top of the rocks in the bottom of it as I crawled through without getting wet besides a little mud. I had the cave maps they made memorized but still carried a laminated copy. Following the weak trickle of water, I crawled a little ways until the ceiling got high enough to walk if you kept your head down. All I had to do was follow the water about 100 feet, then see if the tunnel was clear. That was the only way his body could be. It smelled earthy, with decaying leaves in the weak flow. Looking back over my shoulder, I turned a bend and saw the last bit of reflected sunlight fade out of existence, leaving only my headlamp. Watching my step on the slick, muddy rock, a little salamander wriggled out of the way through the silty water. My heart was pounding in my chest as I made my way deeper into the earth, seeing how little water there was. Every inch of the cave had been checked except for where I was headed. If the passage was clear, I would be the first person to ever go into that part of the cave. Well, the second. The black hole was shaped like an oval, a little over a foot tall, and about 2 feet wide. 2 inches of water ran down the bottom of it. A knot formed in my throat, half feeling like I would cry, and half feeling like I was scared. I knew that I should get someone else, but I couldn't stand thinking about what they would say. They would say there was no point that the body would be washed too deep or buried, and that it could be too dangerous and to let a professional do it. Instead of getting help, I began to drill. The rock was all limestone, and it didn't take too long to get 2 secure bolts drilled to anchor my rope. I put on my harness and got onto my stomach. It's hard to tell just how steep slopes are in a cave, but the water gave me a good idea. I would be squeezing through this hole and essentially rappelling down. Looking in with my headlamp, it seemed like the top was a narrow point and that it might open up. I'd never done anything this tight and steep with water in it, but something pushed me into that black opening where I could hear water falling far below night after night of dreaming. Kieran was down there alone, screaming, terrified. It was a tight squeeze, tighter than I liked. To rappel, I had to have my face down toward the water and turn my head so that I could breathe. I inched down, struggling to use the equipment in the tight space. Progress was painfully slow, as I had to try and turn myself onto my left hip to reach the ATC, scraping into the rock on my stomach. Getting out wouldn't be any easier. The rock pressed in on me harder and harder as the angle got steeper and steeper. I was essentially in a tiny tube with a waterfall going more and more vertical. My problem was that the tube was not equally wide in all places. It was carved by water and would get narrower or wider on whims that I couldn't predict. I'd heard horror stories of Nutty Putty Cave where the carver got stuck in a vertical shaft like this one, and it didn't help. I was coming up on the narrowest part yet, but it looked like it would open up below that. I'd taken my helmet off so that I could squeeze through better. In the tight space with the water splashing my face and running through my shirt and pants, I began to feel fear. Not fear like you feel standing near a ledge. That's a manageable type of fear you can step back from, not a fear that you feel. In the pitch black, unsure of what's around you, you can just find a light. This was a fear beyond that, a fear that each foot of vertical rock builds incrementally inside of you. As you know, your escape becomes harder and harder. A fear that each pound of pressure as the rock smashes into your chest so that you can't breathe increases. A fear that right here, right now, if you panic, you will die. I promised myself that my parents wouldn't lose 2 sons to this cave, that if it got any tighter, any steeper, I would turn around. Just before my will broke, my chest scraped through a tight spot and the tunnel began to open. I almost dropped my helmet down the shaft but managed to put it back on. From the sound of the water falling, I could tell I was entering a large chamber. Shining my light, around there was a domed ceiling with a few small stalactites. A huge murky pool of water was below me, and I couldn't see how deep it was. Large rocks were piled around the edges, and it seemed like the water was shallower on the other side. I rappelled down until my feet hit the water. They just kept going down and down, until I was chest deep and stopped feeding rope. There was no way to know how deep the pool was, but I knew I would have to swim. The rope was my lifeline, and I couldn't leave it. I did an awkward side stroke pulling with one arm and trying to feed out rope with the other underwater. I'd never tried it before and I wouldn't recommend it. It sort of felt like I was going to drown the weight of my clothes and shoes, and the rope making it nearly impossible. Eventually I made it 30 or so feet away from the waterfall and felt my boots start to sink into silty mud. Drenched and breathing hard, I found a rock to sit on. I felt as if I might throw up from the exertion now that the adrenaline was wearing off. A new sort of dread filled me as I looked around. This wasn't a small cave system, and I could hear the water going even deeper. I couldn't be sure, but it looked like there were other tunnels made by other water sources meeting up with this one. Should I follow the main current, as that was likely where Kieran's body would have gone? Or should I try to thoroughly map every tunnel I could find branching off of this chamber? The memory of his loss was fresh in my mind, but it had been almost 3 years. What would I be looking for? What would be left of his body? Scraps of clothing or bones? Regardless of what my dreams told me, what else could there be? I had decided to take a few minutes to rest to gather my thoughts. Rushing things wouldn't help. The sound of water was a white noise, and I began to look around more calmly. I noticed a pale little fish swimming in the murky pool in front of me. All I can remember was a loud cracking sound. Thank God I was wearing my helmet, or I would have been dead. It's strange how, when you get hit on the head, you can lose your sight and sense of balance, but still hear things. I was shocked, but knew that I must have a concussion. There's no way for me to know if I was unconscious for a second or a minute, but I tried to scramble back to my feet in a panic. A rock had struck me from above. It must have come off of the steep side of the chamber from a hidden ledge. My leg was hurt, I could tell that much. There was a sharp pulsing pain on my calf that I'd never felt. It was bad. I kicked my leg by reflex, only realizing consciously what my instincts had already figured out, only seeing the impossible as my dazed head turned around and a scream escaped my mouth. He was eating me. The emaciated boy was pale as death, bloody teeth digging into my leg. Blind eyes were wide open, deep in their sockets above sunken cheeks. Over and over he bit me with a hunger I could never understand. His arms were smaller than my wrists, his collarbone sticking from his chest. I grabbed his shoulder and threw him off of me in terror. He couldn't have weighed 30 pounds. For a second I saw him stand, my blood dripping from his mouth and over the ribs of his chest before he ran into the darkness. Kieran. I screamed his name at the top of my lungs and went to chase him. Still confused from the head trauma, I was yanked backwards by the rope still attached to my harness. I frantically unlocked the carabiner and ran the way he had gone, ignoring the pain in my leg. Drops of black blood lead me to a low, narrow tunnel. In my headlamp, I saw his little feet disappearing around a corner. The crack he had squeezed through was impossibly small. I could never fit into it. Kieran, it's me. It's Chris, it's me! I began sobbing. Why couldn't I have grabbed him? If I just grabbed one of those tiny arms, I could have hugged him, told him I loved him, and brought him back to the sun. Mum and Dad love you, they miss you. I miss you, I yelled over the sound of the waterfall. I kept saying anything I could think of. I said that I had food, tried to wrinkle the wrapper of a granola bar as loudly as I could. Told him that he could go home, screamed until I collapsed on the wet rock. In my mind, the last almost 3 years had been hard. What were they for him alone in the dark, eating anything that swam or crawled he could get his hands on? He was only 5 at the time and would be almost 8 now. Would he be insane? Remember who I was, or even who he himself was? Looking down, a trickle of blood went into the main pool, dyeing it a dark color at the edge. I was bleeding a lot. If I didn't stop it, I wouldn't make the climb back up and no one would know that either of us was down here. Wrapping the leg as tightly as I could, it kept bleeding. I didn't really have the tools to make a proper tourniquet, but tightened the knot as hard as I could until I screamed. Before I went, I left the granola bar unwrapped at the base of the crack Kieran had gone through, along with a spare headlamp turned on to the lowest setting. I screamed that I would be back, promised him, before eventually turning back to the pool. I pulled myself along the rope to the base of the waterfall. Painfully, I made my way back up it and somehow squeezed through the crack. I barely remembered, to be honest, just the suffering of it and wanting to give up. I didn't give up though. Half for myself and half for Kieran. At the mouth of the cave, I collapsed. Seeing the sun brought me to my senses just a little. I called my mum and she answered. I told her I was at the cave out back, that I was hurt, that I had found Kieran. I told her to call an ambulance. The leg is okay. I will be able to use it just fine, even though the scar will never heal. There was too much tissue missing. At the hospital, the doctors agreed that the injury on my leg was from being bitten, probably by a child based on the tooth marks, the Darmstadt. That fact alone was the only reason I could convince anyone that he was still down there, still alive. It seemed impossible, but he must have been eating the fish or anything else he could find. They sent down a search party, but no one can fit into a lot of the tunnels he might have gone down. My parents are a wreck, understandably. Even 3 days later, my dad is hysterical and my mum is just quiet. They wanted to go down to try and talk to him, but there's no way they would make the climb. I barely did. The rescue teams couldn't find him and the tunnel is completely impassable to anyone other than a starved child. No one has seen him, but they put food in the crack I last saw him in. And when they came back the next day, it was gone. I never gave up on him, and I still haven't. Right now, the plan is to leave as much food as we can and hope that the rain forecast tomorrow isn't enough to fill the cave.